My name is Pilar Olivo, and I'm the ACEs liaison with the Child Advocacy Center of Frederick County, Maryland. And I also lead the Frederick County ACEs work group. And I'm really pleased to bring this really fascinating, information-rich webinar to you all with funding through the Frederick County Office for Children and Families. So we had a great grounding last week, and that recording will be available. We'll find a way to get the link to everyone and host it somewhere. And then I'm really excited to see what people think about today's workshop. And then remember, next Wednesday also. All right, thank you so much. Mackenzie, over to you.
Great, thank you. And let's get going. So I am going to now share my screen with everyone, and we will get started. So thank you so much for joining us again this morning. And here's what we've got on tap for today, although you can also see this over one of my shoulders, not sure which one. We're gonna start with a welcome and recap of what we talked about the last time we were with each other last week. And then we're gonna get into this question of, are there messages that backfire and why does that happen? Spoiler alert, yes, there are. And from there, we'll move into the theme that we've been sticking with for this webinar series, which is going through some strategies that do work in order to situate adverse childhood experiences within this larger narrative or frame about supporting healthy and optimal development and brain development specifically. We'll take a quick break, a quick 5-minute break that I will queue up for you. And in that, after the break, we're going to be doing a small group discussion activity. I'll give more instructions for that activity when we get there. We'll spend some time discussing working in small groups, do a share out before recapping everything we've talked about and doing a preview of what is going to come next week, next Wednesday, same time, same place, same channel, if you will. So the last time we were together, we started with a conversation about how having a shared frame or shared tools for talking about a topic like adverse childhood experiences or brain development could help not only help a field move forward, but also help a group of communicators amplify each other's messages, even if they might be situated in different parts of an issue. And our opening to that was just talking about the idea of frames and choices and how information is presented, and remembering that different ways of presenting information can have different effects on the audiences that you might be communicating with. And the conversation about adverse childhood experiences sits in this, or in the series that we're doing, sits in this larger conversation about supporting healthy development for a number of reasons. But one big reason is that it lets communicators who are in the adverse childhood experiences space connect their work and connect their advocacy and connect the supports that will address or prevent adverse childhood experiences to other related issues. And so the way we've been doing this is one, informed by some of the communications and framing research that my colleagues here at Frameworks and I do, but we have situated all of this in what we're calling a brain development narrative, or put another way, a series of strategies for presenting information that connect adverse childhood experiences to why it's important to support development, how the brain and developing body grow, what can stand in the way of development, and connecting that to specific advocacy for adverse childhood experiences. And so as we're going through this series, we have been stopping off and talking about different strategies at different points of this kind of narrative arc that you, fingers crossed, should be seeing on the screen in front of you.
We are not, we're seeing you.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me know. I can fix that because I know what I did wrong.
Actually, I was screen.
There we go.
Okay.
There it is.
All right. Okay. Still, hopefully that's working. Okay. So the last time we were together, we talked about this concept of brain architecture. So the idea that it's early experiences that build the brain, and talking about the early years as a foundation for growth, and using that comparison to architecture, construction, brain building was a way to kind of reframe around some other ideas about how children grow that might be out there. We also spent some time talking about resilience, but using this idea of using the image of a scale that you can add or remove weights to talk about how we either make positive outcomes or load on positive factors so that we offset a negative outcome and keep young people tipped in one direction. And so those were two strategies that we talked about, and two ways of talking about factors that go into this story of healthy development. So how brains are built, and also what it means to have a resilient outcome, and talking about that as something we can influence and something that we can create. So that's where we are so far. And talking about brain development and resilience were two, frames that we were sharing as frames that work and are useful for explaining kind of key concepts in brain development. So if those two topics that we have touched on before are frames that work, here's another question for you. Are there frames that backfire?
Mackenzie, I'm sorry to interject. I just want to underscore, since we have some folks who were not here last time, that these frames are grounded in the science of brain development and the science of resiliency. So it's not that they're purely communication messages that are effective. They actually accurately describe the best science that people understand about children also. So I wanted to just interject that little piece. So.
Yeah, thank you. And I can say a little bit more about that. So the reason that we have these communications tools really goes back to how Frameworks got started as an organization that does research. And our specific mission is to take science and find ways to translate it for wider use. And so the strategies that we've been talking about in this series come from a partnership between Frameworks and the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard. So they are the folks who do the research, who do the science, that help us understand not only how young people develop, but what can get in the way of that development. And we partner with them to figure out how to talk about it. And that is what brings us here together.
Thank you.
No problem. So if we're doing this research to look for ways of talking about science, are there other frames, ways of presenting information that don't work, that we want communicators to avoid? And as I said, yes, I wouldn't be asking the question if I didn't have an answer. So when we get to this question of do frames ever backfire, there are at least two reasons why this happens, or two reasons we talk about for why this happens. So one is a kind of problem or communications problem that we call a you say, but they think problem. And this is something that definitely comes up in the wider conversation, not only about children's well-being, but about health in general, although this can happen in, many different fields. So the example that I have for you today is sometimes we have advocates or communicators who want to have a conversation about how health and physical and emotional and mental health outcomes are a community issue. And they might, as a piece of their messaging, be saying, well, health is determined by a variety of factors. They interact over time. And yes, that is a part of our framework and what we know to be true about outcomes overall. However, just because this is the message doesn't mean that it's either getting through or that your audience is kind of keying into the point that you want to make. And one of the things that we see when advocates and communicators are messaging around health is that their message, health is determined by multiple factors, can run up against the response that you see attributed to the public, that health is about what you eat, whether or not you exercise, your lifestyle, your diet. And yes, that is a part, there is a connection there to health outcomes, but saying, well, health is just, whether or not you exercise is a really individualized frame. And yes, individual action does matter. But if you're an advocate who wants to shift thinking about collective responsibility or collective efficacy, if your issue is stuck in a conversation about what people do or don't do and why they do or don't do it, is something getting in the way of your wider communication goals. There we go. Is something getting in the way? And we would argue, yes, something is getting in the way. And that could be one way that a frame backfiring looks, is that you have what we call this you say, but they think problem. Now, why does this problem happen? We touched on this a tiny bit last week and talking about the idea that pre-existing assumptions or beliefs can sometimes block engagement with the topics that advocates might want to be messaging about. And we talked about a few types of assumptions that we see in our research that might be standing in the way of thinking or engagement around well-being, but also around children's issues. And these are things that communicators not only have to frame around, but if you don't frame around them, can really lead messages to backfire or not have the intended effect. And so a lot of the framing strategies that we've been sharing in this series are designed to help communicators not only talk about the science of brain development, but also talk about the science and not have to get into a conversation about whether or not parents, for example, are the only people who can support healthy brain development. They are a critical piece of building a foundation, but we know, and a big piece of the advocacy around adverse childhood experiences is equipping lots of caregivers to be a part of this system. And so we want to be able to have a conversation about the science, but also not get stuck in a particular assumption about how development happens. So that's one thing, that one way this question of are there frames that backfire can be answered, is that some conversations can get stuck when communicators run up against assumptions like this, and we need framing strategies to help us get around those ways of thinking. And there are, of course, frames that we know do not work, or that definitely backfire, and I've got a few of them that I'll talk through briefly. So one is the idea that it's all about science. So this is one of those places where you really see the other mantra that it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, and also that you are not your own audience. So yes, science and the science of brain development is what brought all of us here together today. But when we're thinking about how we might be messaging more broadly about adverse childhood experiences, relying on science as a messaging strategy can get the conversation stuck in a couple of ways. For example, we know that science is evolving. We know that science can serve multiple purposes. And while we're using science as a tool to understand what interventions or what policies will really support healthy development, in our messaging, it's useful to connect those supports to other ideas, not just science alone. And I'll say more about that as we move forward. Another frame that we see backfiring is something I spoke about earlier. So the idea that parents are the first and only teacher or support for young people. And so yes, it is true that parents are an incredibly important part of a foundation. But one of the wider goals of this work, and one of the things that we see, is that there are many, many caregivers who can help prevent experiences of early adversity, who can help address experiences of early adversity. There are many people who support healthy brain development. And so the idea that it's only what parents do can, one of the ways it backfires is that it crowds out everyone else who communicators or advocates actually might want to be messaging to or about as well. The next idea that can backfire is this notion that it's all about what's in our genes and that our genes are set in stone. Now, again, we talked about this a little bit last week in the brain architecture concept. Genes give us the blueprint for growth, but it's experiences that can turn on those genes or turn off those genes. And so while genes create the foundation for growth or the blueprint for what the construction project is going to look like, it's experiences that actually make the connections and keep that growth going. So the idea that it's only what's in your genes that determines outcomes can crowd out the wider conversation about how a brain grows and how we get to healthy outcomes by leaving out some other pieces of the story. And I've got two more for you. So then the next one is the idea, the next one that can backfire is that prevention is our lead messaging value. So this one is really interesting because prevention is absolutely an internal value, and it's absolutely a strategy for how we think about health responses and health systems. But when it comes to messaging, one of the things we see in our research is that prevention garners a lot of support publicly. However, audiences that we might be messaging to really have a hard time thinking of examples of what prevention actually looks like. And so put another way, when it comes to messaging about early adversity and supporting children's well-being, we find that prevention is something that needs to be explained. It's something that people support, but if it's used as the only kind of value that a whole campaign rests on, that doesn't necessarily work in the way communicators want it to, because it doesn't automatically kind of spark thinking about what you could actually do and what next steps we need to take to prevent whatever we have at hand. And the last strategy that we think of as backfiring or having unintended consequences in messaging is the idea that children are a vulnerable population. And again, this is about, these are frames in messaging and getting back to that key idea that you are not your audience. So how you might be interpreting information does not automatically carry over to how your audience might be interpreting information. And I keep getting back to that point because one of the things we see is that this frame of children are vulnerable and therefore we need to do X as a messaging strategy can backfire because it opens up thinking about, well, why or what is it that their parents did or didn't do in order to make this the case. And when we're working with communicators who want to have a conversation about and do advocacy around collective responsibility and community investment, the conversation about what individual parents did or didn't do can just crowd out the larger advocacy goals of our communicators. And that's a piece of why we say that building a messaging strategy around vulnerability can backfire. So these are different themes that we see having unintended consequences in messaging. And another way that we start to try and understand what the effect of different messages will be is, of course, to test them. And one of the ways that we test messages is through, or test different framing strategies, are through experimental surveys. So something that we might do is through the powers of the internet, call together several thousand folks and field an experimental survey to them and present them with a message like support for, excuse me, mental health support should be available in pediatric care visits. And we will present participants in that survey with a message about the availability of mental health screening tools that's framed in different ways. So a message that doesn't use a value about the importance of mental health screening tools, a message that says, that's framed with something like future prosperity. So investments in our community pay off later on, they're good for our futures. This is why we need to make sure mental health supports are available in pediatric visits. Or we could choose another value, like we know that there are things that we can prevent. This is why we're making mental health supports available in pediatric visits. Or maybe we want to frame that same conversation as a matter of vulnerability. So young people are vulnerable. This is why we're making mental health support available in pediatric visits. So those are 3 different ways of framing that same issue. And we test to see if someone presented with that message is more or less likely to support actually putting those resources into something like a pediatric visit. So I've done all of this lead up now to give you a sense of what it actually looks like when you present someone in the types of experiments that we do with messages that are framed in different ways. And so one of the reasons why I said that this frame of vulnerability can backfire is that when we work with this value in different topics that we've done research on, but particularly when we're doing work trying to build understanding and support for child mental health supports, we see that using a vulnerability value makes people less likely to support actually putting the mental health supports in place. And so one of the reasons we say or know that a value can backfire, that a frame can backfire, is that when we test it, we see that it depresses support. And that's particularly true when it comes to communicating about different supports and interventions that are centered around promoting child mental health specifically. And in the recap of these sessions, I can point you in the direction of where this research sits on our website so you can learn more about this work. So I wanted to talk through this example as a way of opening up this conversation. Well, if vulnerability and prevention don't work in the way that we think they do, are there other values or other messaging strategies we can use? And so to get at that idea, I thought it would be fun to revisit a question I asked you last week in the frame of a poll. So in your discussion groups last week, your icebreaker was talking through, is there a lens that you typically use when you're messaging about early childhood? So do you talk about early childhood as community investment? Do you talk about early childhood as a piece of a public health response? Or do you talk about early childhood through the lens of equity and addressing current inequities in our society? So this was given as an icebreaker, and I thought we could take a minute and answer this as a poll question now, just to see what lenses might be in use in our current messaging. So Jasmine is going to fire up this poll, and we'll see, we'll take a little trip down memory lane and see what lenses might be in use in your communications now. So I will stop the screen share so we can start the poll. All right, so we've got responses coming in, and it looks like a community investment lens is the winner, although an equity lens is also coming in. And let's 5 more seconds to send in your response. Okay, So hopefully if we push the right buttons, the responses to the poll should be popping up on your screen. And it looks like while any of these lenses are in use, it's the community investment lens that across this sample is being used most prevalently. And that's great. That we'll talk more in right now about why that's a useful framing strategy, but also how we can wrap these other lenses. So talking about public health and equity within this wider community investment and future benefits frame. So I will stop the sharing of the responses. I will share my screen, and hopefully the right screen, with all of you. And get us going again. So if we've asked the question, are there, what lens might we use? How can we bring any of these three lenses into the wider story about development that we've been telling so far? So this is where we get into thinking about more strategies that work. And can somebody give me a nod or a thumbs up if they can see my screen that says more strategies that work? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So more strategies that we can use to get at any of these lenses. Now, the last time we were together, we talked about what it means for a frame to work. And what we mean by that is that in the various testing that we do, it helps people know more about a topic, it shifts attitudes about a topic, or it gets people to support a particular piece of policy. And so the first strategy that I want to talk about today is a value. So we just asked the question, what lens do you use to talk about early childhood? And a lot of people talked about a community investment frame. And that's fantastic. One of the reasons I think that's fantastic is because that is a frame that we have specifically experimented with. And we see that it is an effective one when it comes to messaging about child development and situating something like adverse childhood experiences inside of this story of what it means to support healthy brain development and why that's connected to health outcomes. So you might have heard this core concept kind of named a couple of different things. Sometimes we talk about it as prosperity. Sometimes we talk about it as a return on investment. But the key idea we're getting at is that supporting healthy development is a way to contribute to our future and a good future for our community. And that good fortune can be from a social sense, from a community sense. You could also think about it as an economic sense, but the idea that what we do now matters for what happens later is the key idea that we're calling this prosperity value. Now, this is an idea that can wrap around other concepts like a conversation about public health or a conversation about equity. So for example, we can say that an equitable society depends on the well-being of children. If we address the needs of children now, we're addressing inequities in our society and addressing that for the future. So that's making a marriage really between this core idea that what we do now matters, what we do around well-being matters, and making this tie between the ways that we work for equity and address inequities as part of our planning for our better future. And so the prosperity value, this forward-looking value, is one of the pieces of the wider brain development story that we've developed. So what does it look like to actually put this value into practice? We'll talk through an example. So on the screen, you should have an excerpt from a piece of messaging, a piece of communications from a resource called Help Me Grow, which is a network that is designed to make a connection between developmental resources and families. And it's a statewide model that has a national hub. And so this is kind of showing how we can take the prosperity value and plug it into existing messaging. So if this is the before, what would it look like to bring the prosperity value into this messaging? And we did it in two ways, just by adding two clauses to this sentence. So our final version starts out by saying, the success and well-being of our communities depends on the actions we take today. And then we've kept the same opening from before. So Help Me Grow is strategically positioned to both define and support the shared agenda for supporting optimal health and development of all young children. Here's another place where we get at the prosperity value. To implement Help Me Grow's investment in our community's future, key early childhood leaders and players need to be integrally involved. This inclusive stakeholder group is a strategic vehicle for establishing a common agenda, as well as the underlying value structure and conception of the goals and mission. So this text is something that came out of an annual document for this group. But in this one paragraph, we found two ways to connect this wider conversation about what this network is doing to support healthy development. Two ways to get at the prosperity value. So talking about what we do now matters for our future, and situating the work that this network does as a particular kind of investment, and an investment in communities. So adding in hints of this prosperity value is one way that we can start to situate messaging in this conversation about what can we do at the community level to support healthy development. That's one strategy that we have at our disposal. I'm going to talk about another strategy now, and that is really getting into the center of the science around early adversity and adverse childhood experiences. So the strategy I want to talk about now, you may have heard of in at least by two different names. So sometimes we call it the 3 types of stress strategy. Sometimes we call it the toxic stress strategy. And I'll talk through what those two names mean. But the core idea is that this strategy is a way to talk about not only what early adversity is and what its impacts are, but also how those impacts can be either prevented or addressed. And so this is one of those strategies that really does a lot of translation work when it comes to explaining the science of early adversity. So the idea behind this 3 types of stress strategy is that experiences can cause different stress responses, and there are at least 3 types of responses that can be caused. So when we say there's 3 types of stress, there can be positive stress. So that is, experiences that cause maybe an increased heart rate, but they're normal pieces of our development. Something like nerves before taking a test. That kind of stress could be positive stress. There's the tolerable stress. So these are more severe or longer types of experiences that cause a heightened stress response. But again, these are types of stress that if there are supportive or responsive relationships with an adult, those relationships can provide a buffer and help the body calm down from that stress response, which is why we frame them as tolerable types of stress. And it's the last category that you may have heard of, this idea of toxic stress. And so this is the idea that when the body is experiencing something that is a prolonged adversity, prolonged exposure to a particular stressor, or prolonged stress response, that response and that response can ultimately disrupt development and can have a toxic effect on the a toxic effect on the developing brain, and a toxic effect on the developing body as well. And so being able to break stress responses into this typology to say that there are different types of stress, different types of experiences, and different types of stress responses is one strategy that helps communicators talk about what exactly is going on when young people experience different types of events. And that is a key part of being able to message and frame and explain what is happening when young people are experiencing adversity. Now, there's another part of this toxic stress concept that I want us to think about. So if we have a typology of stress, we've got positive stress, tolerable stress, and stressors that cause this toxic response. Toxic stress talks about a really specific category. So it's stressors that are chronic, it's stressors that are unrelenting, and we know that they have a really negative effect or have a kind of corroding or toxicity effect. But another piece of this is the idea that having relationships, important relationships, stable relationships, responsive relationships can make this stress or make the experience of this stress more tolerable. And that it's adding in relationships to young people's lives. That's one of the ways that we can either address or ameliorate this kind of stress response when it does happen. Now, I've got a few tips for how you might use this toxic stress concept, because you can feel the severity in it when you talk about something as being toxic. And we want to add in some tips that can help communicators use this with some sensitivity and use this effectively. And it looks like I'm going backwards now instead of forward. Okay, so tips for using toxic stress. So a few things that it's really important to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about how to use this framing strategy. So one thing is that in addition to there being multiple types of experiences, we're not trying to say with toxic stress that early adversity automatically means there will be negative health outcomes. But we are using the fact that there are multiple types of stressors to make the point that if we have that relationships, supportive and responsive relationships, can be a buffer against this kind of toxicity. So we're not saying that early adversity automatically causes negative outcomes, but we want to talk about the fact that early adversity can have this negative effect. And that's why we're focusing on addressing stressors or making sure that young people are connected to these supportive relationships. Being able to talk about the effect that the experience of adversity can have is also a way to point to the services and the interventions that we're advocating for and be able to talk about exactly what it is that they do. So if we can frame a particular intervention as a way to prevent a particular stress response, that's one of the ways we can situate that intervention inside of the wider brain development story. It's something that supports brain development by buffering the effects of toxic stress. I also want to say that we know there can, we definitely want to kind of avoid stigma in the way that we message. And so one of the opportunities that talking about different types of stress provides communicators is to make the point that caregiving is a variety of skills. It's a skill that can be built, it can be supported. And one of the reasons we support caregiving is it's a way to provide a buffer against the toxicity of certain adverse experiences. And it also helps us situate stress and adversity as a community concern. And we know that it's community resources that provide a buffer against stress, it's interventions that provide a buffer against stress, or it's interventions that support caregivers who are in turn the buffer against different types of stress. And so these are some important tips to keep in mind as we're thinking about how to use this concept. So talking about the effects of early adversity through the lens of toxic stress and through that comparison is one strategy, but also talking about the interventions that we're advocating for as a buffer against stress is another strategy that communicators have at their disposal when they're having a conversation about early adversity and how it relates to brain development. So I know I've taken you through a lot of things, and we are just about to do some reflection on everything that we've gone through this morning. And what I want us to do is start to think about how we can tell our own story, tell your own story about adverse childhood experiences using all of the different strategies that we've gone through so far today. So we've been talking about telling the story about how how the brain develops and how the body grows through this lens of brain development. And I've been using this graphic at various times throughout the series, but this is the point in things where we start to say, okay, how are we going to put all of this into our own words that match what we want to accomplish in Frederick County? And so I'll give you a taste of what that looks like. So if you want to use the brain story to message, what is it that I would like you to do? So using the brain story to message around adverse childhood experiences means talking about adverse childhood experiences either through the lens of future prosperity, or it means talking about addressing adverse childhood experiences through the lens of building resilience or building strong brains or preventing or addressing toxic stress. And so this is the point where we start to kind of fill in what it looks like to say this in our own words. So let's say we wanted to use the brain story to message something like universal home visiting. So what does it mean to take that topic and plug it into the story about brain development? So one of the things it means is putting language together like this. So the way we support children today builds Frederick County's future. That's an introduction to this concept using the prosperity value. We could also talk about home visiting and what it provides through the lens of building brains, through the lens of serve and return, which is something we'll talk about in our next section. So we could say home visiting programs are what give caregivers the skills they need to build brains, or that home visiting is where caregivers learn skills like serve and return interactions that build brains. And then we can kind of tie the story together saying, if we're going to support development, we need to not only fund home visiting, but maybe offer additional screening tools inside of those visits. So what we're starting to do is taking the topics that we might want to message and matching those with the different strategies that we've been working through today. And so this is what I would like us to discuss in our breakout groups. So in a few moments, we're going to take a break. Not now, not yet, but in a few moments. But before I send you on your break, I want to give you some instructions for what we're going to do when we come back. So before we go on a break, I'm going to share a handout with you that matches the slides that I'm sharing. You also got this, if you pre-registered for this session, you also got this handout in your email yesterday. But if you don't have that email, that's okay. I'm about to send you a file through the chat function of this webinar. So you'll get these same instructions and these same slides in just one moment. So what I'd like you to do when we come back from the break is in your breakout groups, get started as soon as the room opens, and get started by sharing your name and your role. It would be really helpful if you'd pick a moderator to kind of keep conversation flowing. I trust you to pick a moderator yourself. And then as a group, I'd like you to start doing what I just showed you on the slide before, thinking about how can we use brain development to talk about a topic that's particularly important to us. So in order to do that, it's useful to talk through at least two things. So one, are there key ideas that you need to message? This is something you can discuss as a group. Perhaps it's home visiting, perhaps it's parenting or caregiving classes, perhaps it's something else, but what's a key idea that you need to message? And then are there strategies that you can use to make a case for this program? So does home visiting help build brains? That's a way to use brain architecture. Does home visiting give a buffer against adversity? That's a way to use toxic stress. Does home visiting build resilience? That's a way to use this resilience concept. And you can discuss this as a group. Now, if you're really moving fast, you can start to think about specific language you might use to make a case for home visiting. But when you first get started, it's just those two things that we'd like you to get through. What are the key topics you want to be messaging? And what strategies could you use to start making a case for them? And Pilar and I will float across the groups and visit and check in but you don't need to wait for us in order to get started. Now, the slide I'm about to click through for a break says we're going to get started at 9:30. That is incorrect. We're going to get started at 9:35. So you've got about 3 minutes. And don't worry about being sent to a breakout room. We'll take care of it. But when you get to your screen at 9:35, you will find yourself in a group, and I will send you these same instructions that you see on the screen in front of you so that you have an idea of what I'd like you to talk through. So we'll get started in our breakout groups at 9:35. So that's in about 3 minutes.
Mackenzie, I think you might need to adjust my status so I can circulate.
Oh, yes, I will. Thank you for.
Thanks. Or Jasmine might need to.
We're all good.
Okay, through the chat function, which is at the bottom left of your Zoom screen, you'll see a PDF that's called Planning Your Narrative, and that has the instructions for today's discussion. And it's a 2-page PDF. It has the same instructions that I shared with you. Let me share my screen one more time so you can see what those instructions look like. So you will be receiving, if you click on that attachment in the chat function, you will get a document that has these instructions and this graphic, or this graphic. So you can use that to help structure the discussion in your breakout groups. But what we're hoping for is that you'll start to think about what key ideas you want to message using the brain story. And then 2, think about what strategies you can use to make a case for those key ideas. So it could be community investment, it can be building brains, it can be preventing stressors, it can be buffering the toxicity of early adversity. And we'll send you to breakout groups in just 1 minute. Jasmine?
Hello.
Oh, hi. I was like, where am I? It's like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. Okay. We've got folks coming back into the main room now. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Okay, so you had some great conversations in the breakout rooms, and as we did last time, we'll just take a few minutes to share out a little bit about what we heard. So Pilar, can you share some of what you heard in the breakout rooms you visited?
One of the groups that I heard was really struggling with, trying to figure out how to think about incorporating the resilience scale into describing the need for trauma-informed services. And so they were starting with trauma-informed services, and then kind of as the main focal point for, and then ending with resiliency as the why. And we talked about shifting the starting point to being having a resilient Frederick, and the trauma-informed services are how you get there as the element for how you get there. So and then we talked about, the importance of maybe having some screening so that way you could really understand people's needs and have a sense of how to adjust the positives that you need to add to the scale. So that was one breakout. Another breakout room that I joined was really intensely focused on, so their audience is like they want to figure out how to talk to parents, talk to families who are in the midst of crisis. And so they were struggling with some of the examples that we've seen today and last week were for a different kind of more sophisticated audience. And so they wanted to see sort of stripped down language. And that was the basic conversation, is like, we need to strip this down. We need it to be really, really simple. And we said we would commit to working together, but we didn't come up with anything in the moment. So.
Thank you. So one, I can say that thinking about how to talk to different audiences and kind of different versions of the strategies we're talking about is absolutely where we're going to pick up when we see each other next Wednesday morning. And then also that theme of resilience and being able to talk about that in different ways is something I heard across the breakout rooms I visited too. So thinking about being able to talk about different programs, like something like a program that teaches coping skills as something that builds resilience for families and parents, also something that builds resilience for resilience skills for children as well. And another thing that I heard is also that this kind of whole effort of being able to talk about what early experiences, and be they adverse or positive experiences do, is that it helps us be able to look at children who need support and say, it's not what's wrong with them, but we know there's a connection to what happened to them, and being able to talk about that through the lens of protective or risk factors. And so that's a way to kind of situate this larger conversation. And one other thing I heard before we wrap up is a lot of groups talking about how brain building connects to childcare. And so using this brain building and supporting development frame as a way to not only help people understand what childcare is, but to also make a case for expanded access to childcare, especially as a part of addressing the pandemic and kind of moving forward. And so, and also in addition to, one of my favorites, home visiting, is something that came up in different breakout groups as well. So we are right up at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much for the great discussion today. And when we see you here next week, same time, same place, we're going to do an activity similar to the one we started in these breakout groups. So thinking about how can I plug what I want to do into this conversation about brain building, and also thinking about different audiences that we might want to reach out to and how to change the language accordingly, and some examples of what that looks like. So thank you so much for joining us. And we will make sure that the slides and the recordings for today are made available, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Have a great day.